Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. It is Thursday, September 10th, 2020. Like I mentioned in the pre-meeting announcement, this is the third time that we've attempted to do this. I'm working off of a generator power. We're out of power here in part of Salt Lake City, Utah, due to a windstorm that we had this week. We're going on our fourth day now without power here. So fingers crossed, and everything will go just fine. So I love this topic. I love the idea of an inner child, and I'm going to try to take it away from what I think might sound like a little bit of woo-woo therapy. I think it might sound a little strange or like psychobabble, and really make it practical, because this really is a practical topic. I think there are a lot of exercises, there are a lot of assignments that can make it feel a little bit mystical or made up. And the inner child is really just getting in touch with those parts of us, those feelings in us, those dilemmas in us that have been there since childhood, that have been buried or forgotten, at least by our conscious mind. So with that, I'll get into it. For those of you that are listening to the podcast, you won't be able to see this first slide. It really is a slide that you need to see. This was a post on social media that went viral, and I want to talk about it at the outset. There's a picture of a young man on what looks like a train, maybe in New York City. He's given up his seat for a mother and her daughter. He's allowing his mother to rest. She seems tired. She's resting on his outstretched hand, and then he's carrying both his bag and his mother's purse. And the caption goes like this: this little boy gave up his seat to a lady who entered the train with a stroller and a baby. Then, as he is standing, his mom falls asleep with her head on the bare railing. He takes her bags and carries them. Then he puts his hand in between her head and railing so he can use it as a pillow. I don't want to paint this with one simple brush, and I don't want to be cynical about this, but I wanted to post this and to share this on this broadcast tonight to say that there's something about this picture that also can be troubling. There's something about this experience in life that can be troubling. And that is that this boy is taking on very mature responsibilities in his life. And it is that experience as children of propping up others, of propping up our parents, that doesn't necessarily have to, but can have lasting effects in our lives. There are many of us, and I put myself in this category and include myself there, that part of our greatest challenges come from this part of us who see our value principally, and maybe even only at times, as what we can give to other people. And while, of course, I would want to promote charity, I would want to promote altruism and kindness and love and compassion and service. Of course, all of those things are virtues worth recognizing. They can, when asked for in childhood, have long-term negative effects. And if we develop in such a way that we think we have to compromise ourselves and our own needs, in other words, if the message is so strong that it removes the reality that we need to take care of ourselves. We've probably all heard examples and use of the metaphor on airplanes where you must secure your own mask first. If we think that taking care of ourselves is a bad thing or the wrong thing to do, then we're going to end up in difficult situations in our life. We're going to even end up in difficult situations in our parenting. So I wanted to start off with that idea. So we're going to talk about inner child work and how it relates to parenting, and some of the work that we do in our Evoke Therapy Intensives. And here's what I wanted to begin with. Basically, inner child work is the process of getting into contact with your authentic self, understanding your core feelings, struggles, and dilemmas. And like all of us, these becomes themes throughout our lives. And since these feelings, these struggles, these dilemmas are underneath many of our interactions, and they are at play, we struggle in our relationships. I was just talking to my therapist this last week, and she's worked at a university for decades, and she's worked in large organizations at times at a hospital. She said, as we were commenting about some of the things that are going on in our world, in our society today, that what's really going on in those boardrooms often is people working out their own childhood issues. It's not the content or the topics that are being discussed. It's not those issues that create the problems in the bureaucracy, but it's really the unresolved childhood issues, the issues of ego, of insecurity, of not being seen, of being reactive and triggered by various things. There's a saying in Al-Anon that says, if it's hysterical, it's historical. That's really what's at play in our lives. And so inner child work is really just going back and uncovering what's in play. What are the dilemmas that we've experienced that we haven't resolved because we haven't been conscious of them, because they were either pre-verbal or non-verbally stored in our brains. And we know this from neuroscience now today. We internalize the words, feelings, and thoughts of those around us in childhood as about us. I'll say that again. We internalize the words, feelings, and thoughts of those around us as about us. Anxiety, for example, which we are told early on is born from love, tells us something about us is wrong. When the child sees the consternation on his mother or his or her caregiver's face, the child internalizes that as, I am bad. I want to be clear about this. This is not some abstract construct or off-center theory. These things are measured in children. They are in distress. Their central nervous system is affected when the parent is upset or anxious. And the child internalizes it as something is wrong with them. So let's talk about what the inner child is. And really, what I found for myself, both in facilitating our workshops, but also in sitting in therapy, is that as we do inner child work more and more, we become more clear we become more communicative with those parts of ourselves that are hidden. How did or does really, when we think about the fact that the inner child is present in a certain construct and a certain way of thinking, how did he or she feel growing up? And the easiest way to really access that is what are your triggers? What are the themes in your relationships that challenge you? What are the patterns in your difficulties with your partners and with your children, with your coworkers, team members, with your employees, employers? How did we feel about ourselves? This is crazy, but I just found my father passed away in March, which I've shared several times. My father passed away of COVID in March, with some underlying conditions, of course. And just this week, I received in the mail from his ex-wife, my ex-stepmother. I received a couple of packets of childhood pictures of him as a child. And one of the things I received was an assignment I did when I was 12 years old, called Me, Myself, and I. And it had several things in it. There was a picture that I drew of myself. There was an autobiography. There was a list of memorable events. There was a description of my house that I had to write. And when I was describing myself as a child, in a very short, it wasn't a long autobiography, I described myself as a menace. I described myself as at least being told that I was sensitive or too sensitive. Those kinds of ideas, the fact that I was able to articulate it at 12 was amazing. But those kinds of ideas stick with us. They rest in the back of our minds. I was just telling somebody this week, When I was in treatment as a 16-year-old, I turned 17 in a treatment center. I remember one of my first group therapy sessions, at least one of the first ones that was focused on me. And I entered the group therapy session with not a lot on my mind, not feeling very emotional, and we ended up talking about fathers. My parents had been divorced, and in the middle of the group, while talking about that, I became very emotional, very raw. A lot of grief and hurt and pain and sadness because my father wasn't in my life. I had talked about it in therapy prior to this, and it didn't seem, at least I didn't think it was present. I thought at 16, 17 years old, I had resolved the issue because I had talked about it a handful of times in therapy up to that point. And when I left therapy, within half an hour, I was back to kind of a baseline level of emotionality, of experiencing emotions. And I remember thinking that day, still to this day, it's one of the things that stands out to me about my early treatment was that was amazing. In fact, it's one of the things that got me thinking about the possibility of being a therapist. Because I thought, I didn't feel anything going into the group. I felt a whole bunch during the group. And I didn't seem to feel anything afterwards. And I thought for the first time, there is stuff in me, buried or hidden, that I don't have conscious access to. That's simply the idea of the inner child. It's unconscious or subconscious emotions, dilemmas, ideas, feelings, thoughts that have an effect on our daily lives and our relationships. So how did we feel about ourselves? What did we need that maybe we got, or maybe even more importantly, that we didn't get? When I was training a therapist recently and I was talking about this, and they said, what do I do when that part of me that gets reactive and triggered comes up in an interaction? Do I try to soothe it and tell it will be okay? And I said, you can try that, but maybe you just listen to it. I've told this story before, and I wrote a blog about it and wrote something about it in my new book. I was invited to be a guest on my publisher's radio show on Sirius XM radio a few years ago. And it was her gratitude show. It was around Thanksgiving time, and she invited what she called her favorite guests of the year, and I was among them. And in retrospect, I always think that should have been enough for me to know that she cared and liked me enough to invite me to her show with her favorite guests. But I unfortunately brought myself to the show. And there were about 12 or 13 guests that were there, and we took turns being interviewed during the 2 or the 3 hour block. I don't remember how long it lasted. And we were interacting socially during the break and before and after. And I was nervous. I didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't feel like I belonged. This was in New York City in the Sirius studio, and I was the only one not from New York. I happened to be there for another event, and so I could attend it in person. I was the only one not from New York, and I felt small, like I didn't qualify. And I spent a lot of my time trying to, both off air and sadly on air, trying to prove to everybody that I had something of value to add, that I had some worth. As we were leaving the studio, my wife said to me, "What happened? You struggled, you seemed to be struggling the entire time." And I couldn't even defend myself. I said, "You're right, I was anxious, it was difficult." And she said, "Yeah, you kept talking about yourself, you were interrupting people and talking about you." And I just shuddered in shame. It's a characteristic in myself, and sometimes even in others, that I do not admire. Kind of that self-centered me. Anyway, I came home a couple of days later. I was in therapy with my therapist, and I was relating this story to her. And with the same shudder and shame, I said to her, "I hate that part of myself. I wish I wouldn't do that. I've got to stop doing that." And she said, "Or maybe you could just write about it." She said, "I'm sure other people could relate to it. Maybe you could just write about what you were feeling, what was underneath the behavior, which I did then. I wrote a blog, and later I included it in my book, like I said. And I don't know how many people have read it and related to it, but since that day that I wrote it down the first time, since that day that I shared it with her and had the idea of not leaning away from it because of shame, but leaning into it and listening to what the inner child, if you will, the part of me that feels small and not big enough and that I don't fit in and that I'm not worth much, leaning into that was going to be the solution. Since that day, in moments when I'm feeling small or insecure and threatened, I am more able to hear it. Again, the construct of the inner child is a separate person, right? Separate entity. It is just a construct. It's just a theory. But when I get in touch with that part of myself who didn't feel seen by my parents, who didn't feel like I mattered. I've said sometimes, I spent 30 years of my life after childhood trying to prove to the world that I had something to give. And if I had escaped childhood with the sense that I was enough, I could have spent those same 30 years just giving my gifts to the world, whatever those are. So that experience and exercise is an example of getting in touch with, staying in touch with the inner child. How did people respond to me as a child? My needs, my feelings, my behaviors. I had a single mother for much of my upbringing, and I was, for them, a pretty big child. I had a lot of energy, a lot of needs, and my mother has said to me, "You were too big for me. I didn't know what to do." What does a child do when a mother feels overwhelmed? A child, and we can understand this really, really easily, a child begins to think something is wrong with them. Because again, it's just biology. If you're too much for your parents, for your single mother, you risk abandonment. Ultimately, really what you risk is death, right? At a really primal level, because if you're too much for your mother and she leaves you or abandons you, at a primal level, your very survival is threatened by it. What are the traumas that we carry? I want to share right now, because the list, as you can see, is focusing on kind of the woundedness and the traumas. There's something in psychology that we know that's called a negativity bias. It's from our understanding of biology, and that is this. The human brain focuses on the negative more. It attends to the negative, to the threats, more than it does the positive. And let me give you a simple example that illustrates it perfectly and easily. If I'm walking through the jungle and I don't see a tiger in the bush, I could die. So my brain is going to focus on the threat, the tiger, the negative. If I miss, for example, some low-hanging fruit, I miss a meal. So we can understand why the brain is wired to pay attention to traumas and wounds more than positive. It was funny in that little booklet that I wrote as a 12-year-old, Me, Myself, and I, it asked for a list of I don't know how many memories, and every one of them was an accident, getting stitches, getting hurt. And the teacher even commented on it. How did we express our needs? Did we express them with big emotions? Did we express them maybe not at all? Did we learn to turn inside of ourselves because we felt like our needs were too much of a burden? All of those things have an impact on us young and stay with us throughout our lives. Who are the significant players in our child's life, and how and what is the impact of those relationships? My father, his absence, is as big of an impact on my life as my single mother, who did the best she could raising 3 boys, mostly by herself. What are the messages and the ideas that I internalized? And again, it takes time. This is what I've learned about inner child work, about therapy in general. Early in my career, I used to think that through some exercises, some of the exercises that we do, for example, at the intensives, that mostly therapy was about kind of going back and remembering our childhood. And then, of course, when we remember our childhood and we're able to answer some of these questions that I've listed today, then we kind of know what we're made of, kind of how we're built brick by brick. But what I've learned that is more common is that it is in our current day experiences how we feel. And when we unpack the exchange that I had with my daughter earlier today, or the conversation I had with my wife last evening, when I process that, unravel that in therapy, my childhood comes more and more into focus. I've shared this idea before. 21, 20, 18 years ago, when I would share, when I was in therapy with my therapist, she would often say to me, well, that's because your mother was this, or that's because your father was this. And I used to think, how does she know that? I haven't talked about my mother and father enough for her to know that's specific of an idea about them. I was very skeptical. It didn't really land with me. And now, today, after the work that I've done, after 22 years, 21 years of therapy with her, it's obvious everything she was saying was right on. It's clear to me. You know, I can see it. I can see it and how it shows up for me today. How do we feel and respond to our inner child? In other words, how do we feel and respond to our fears, our insecurities, our negative messages? Like I told you just a few moments ago, when I had that experience in New York City at the radio show, my response, and I thought this was the solution. I think, like most people, I was taught that responding this way was the solution. I thought that characteristic who was talking about himself and trying to promote himself and interrupting people, I was so, I found it so repulsive. I had such a strong, visceral shame response to it. I thought that was the solution. And because I thought that was the solution, I was afraid to give away my shame, to let it go. Because if not for shame, why would I do anything better? How would I grow? How would I improve? So that's an example of me responding to the manifestation, right? The talking and the interrupting, that's the manifestation of my inner child, the child who felt insecure and not seen, unimportant, disposable, small. I was responding to it with disdain instead of compassion. And I think that is the magic idea right there. The shift that we try to make and evoke with your children and with you all in these podcasts and webinars and in the intensives, if you show up, is what if we responded to our wounds and the symptoms that come out of our wounds? What if we responded to them with compassion and curiosity instead of disdain? And then here's the next magical idea. We start to respond to other people, most importantly our children, with the same curiosity and compassion. I was just having a clinical meeting this week with our therapist, and I was talking about parent work and how important parent phone calls are and parent work is in the wilderness. And I was saying, look, if you get frustrated with a parent or disappointed or exhausted by a parent, understand they're just children themselves. And it's really important that you respond to them with as much compassion as you would any client. It's vital that you do. They need the same model. They need the same experience in order to heal. in order to uncover what keeps them or gets them stuck. So how do we heal all of this? We spend time around people who respond to our inner child with compassion and curiosity. And that's why one of the biggest problems in psychotherapy can be that if your therapist responds with frustration, disappointment, anger, exhaustion, they're merely replicating the wounds that you already received from your family of origin. And that's their issue, not yours. Understanding our shame, our fear, our insecurity, and our resources. Was there somebody that saw you? My dissertation was based on the finding that if one person was consistent in our childhood and saw us, it contributed to our resilience more than any other variable that we could study, that we could find. And then we use these resources to take care of those parts. We gravitate toward people who can see us. Some of you, if you're on Instagram, you might know that this woman, she calls herself the Holistic Psychologist. She has some great content. And she talks about, I borrowed it from a recent post she had about inner children. And this particular post is entitled, A Wounded Inner Child Looks Like. So I'm just going to read what she said. Number 1, acting out when hurt or overwhelmed the same way we did as children. Door slamming, screaming, shutting down, stomping off. Most of us can identify with some of those behaviors sometimes. Number 2, denying your own reality and the reality of other people's experience. This is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. One of the things that comes out of this work for parents and children and families and couples, one of the things that comes out of this work is you stop denying your experience and other people's experiences. Right? As you heal, as you grow, you start listening to people and believing their experience. I was just watching a series on Apple TV this last week. And just like many of the shows that I watch, it was a drama. Over and over again, the parents, to each other and to their child, in a way that many people would consider supportive, that's the irony, would ask the other character how they felt about a certain interaction, a certain situation. And when the person shared it, they tried to make it better, try to make it okay. And it was just a reflection of what goes on in our society all the time, every day, almost everywhere. Of course, with you folks who are doing your work, you start to listen to people and just hear them and sit with them and be a witness. Number 3, easily defensive with children. Easily defensive with childlike black and white and or thinking, right? And that black and white, either or thinking is primitive thinking. It's young thinking. Number 4, has childlike fantasies of a romantic partner rescuing them. I talked about this in my new book on the chapter on couples, on marriage and love. I thought for most of my life, until somewhere in my 40s, that I thought my business partner was supposed to rescue me, or my marriage partner, my wife, was supposed to rescue me. I really did. And it wasn't until my 40s that I realized I was supposed to rescue me. I was the one who had to take the difficult, courageous step, courageous because it's terrifying, step to stand my ground, to be myself, to embrace, to love what I affectionately call my horrible, rotten self. That had to be me. Now, I did that, of course, with the help and support of an amazing, wise, and loving therapist and a wife who's doing her work, but it had to be me. Number 5, views parents as all-knowing and continues to desperately seek what a parent is not able to give. One of my themes the last few weeks is not knowing the answer. I can't emphasize enough what a gift it is to those that we love to not have the answer. To respect and empathize with their well-earned and well-deserved dilemma, and to not have an answer for them. To sit with somebody in their unanswerable problems is a real gift. It's love. But we think that as parents, we think we're supposed to have the answers. And to the extent that we're still working on our own dilemmas from our childhood, we're waiting for other people to have the answers, our therapists, right? I remember I was doing supervision with my therapist a few years ago, and I was presenting a case that was a dilemma that I just couldn't imagine a solution to with a client that had come to me. And I said to her, after describing the circumstances in detail, I said to my therapist, I don't know what to tell them. And my therapist simply said, good, keep it that way. Honor them by not having the solution, by not having the answer. And then I remembered my job. My job is to create an experience with an individual so they can find their answer. Jamie Gill, who wrote the Fortnite book, talked about that. If the therapist has answers for you, for your problems, that's the therapist's answers. But a real therapist, a real psychotherapist, is interested in you finding your answers. It's the same with our children. The Buddhists talk about the beginner's mind. It means not knowing. Number 6, betrays self regularly to receive love. I borrowed from the musical Wicked in my first book to illustrate this. There's a line in the song Defying Gravity by Elphaba. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. If you have, you know what I'm talking about. Where the Wicked Witch was asked to support the wizard's farce, the wizard's game. And she just wasn't willing to do it. And there's a line in there, she says, if this is love, if I have to deny myself, not be myself, not be authentic, not embrace what I know to be true to get love, it becomes at too high of a cost. And I know it's just a musical, but the really good musicals, the really good movies, the really good stories are trying to teach us about life. Number 7, shames others for their beliefs or behaviors. I think it's important that we're constantly attending to that instinct in ourselves towards others and towards ourselves. That's what my therapist was trying to teach me with her response to that story about the New York City interview, is if you can respond to it with compassion, curiosity, understanding, you can heal it. If you respond to it with disdain and being repulsed by it, or shame in other words, it'll continue. It'll crop up somewhere else in the garden, as they say. Number 8, constantly compares self to others while feeling inferior. I don't even know if I need to say anything more about that one. I love this quote. I borrowed it from my book. It's in The Audacity to Be You. It says, a child that's being abused by its parents doesn't stop loving its parents, it stops loving itself. You know that's true. You've seen it depicted in stories and in real life over and over and over again. You know it's true. And it's just an illustration of what I've been talking about, which is how the experience we have of ourselves in our contexts, we internalize as about us, not about our context. I go on to say, thus we need more than new information. We must re-experience ourselves in a different context to let go of the ideas we carry around inside that we internalize from our previous context. from the people that surround us in our childhood. And that's why I say, and I try to do it on a podcast, but it's hard. I try to do it on the webinars, but it's harder in the books. But I talk about our therapists at Evoke constantly. It's about being different with your clients, with the children in our program, the adolescent and young adult children in our program, and with the children that we call parents, that we have our weekly phone calls with. I just had a meeting with our intensive team today, and we were talking about that at length. It's being different, providing them a different context. Therapy is not about the exchange of information, although that happens. It's not merely about teaching skills, although that happens. It's about showing up in a different way with somebody and having them recognize that difference. The inner child is a model for understanding your history, the impact of life events, your relationships, and the needs that drive your current day behavior. That's all it is. It's not more mystical than that. Like I said, I'll talk about the exercises, but it's just going back. It's like what Alice Miller says, my favorite quote from my favorite book on childhood, that we have only one enduring weapon. She says we have only one enduring weapon in our battle against mental illness, and that is the discovery of the unique emotional history of our childhood. So we do role plays. We imagine that we can travel back in time. We can do this through a guided imagery where we go and visit our younger selves playing on a playground. We can practice and have a dialogue with them. Right? It's not a silly or a hokey exercise. It's just an exercise. And by doing this often, we can get in touch with feelings that we might not be aware of, that are present, that are driving things. We can write a letter to or from our younger selves to us. That's one of the things we do at our intensives program, at our Finding You program. How old do you go back to? When I visit my inner child, it's right around the divorce of my parents. I don't think of it that way. It's just the image that comes to mind. Around 8 years old. What would they ask from you? What do they need from you? See, most of the time when people go back to visit their inner child in these exercises, they want to give them a reassuring lecture. Tell them that everything will be okay and that it'll work out. But I think the more interesting process is listening to what the inner child wants, needs, and feels. Folks, they're the ones with the wisdom that's lost, not us. I know your children have memorized your lectures. Do you know how I know that? Because 3 weeks into their wilderness therapy program, they're giving your lectures to the other kids. All the time. What's more important, what's more valuable is listening to what the inner child asks and says. And again, if we're imagining our inner child as a separate entity through an exercise like a guided imagery exercise or a letter, we listen. We thank them for talking, for sharing. We don't solve it. You won't make it okay by telling yourself simply you're okay. When your scared inner child shows up, it's more impactful to say, I hear you. It makes sense. I understand why you get scared or feel insecure in these situations. My parents, and they did the best that they could, my parents were preoccupied when I was a child. They were children themselves, trying to get away from their families of origin, their parents. And their marriage and having us boys was a way for them to get away from, to grow up. That's what they did. I was sharing with my mother. I talked to her after I had found this packet, and I was sharing with her the stories. And one was when my mother's water broke when she was pregnant with my younger brother. I wandered across the street and took a bunch of pills that were sitting on the counter of the neighbor, my parents' best friend. Another time I ate a bunch of cigarettes. Another experience was I said this. I said on my first birthday, I'm 12 years old when I'm writing this. On my first birthday, I burned my finger on my birthday candle and it ruined the party. 1-year-olds aren't in charge of getting burned by their own birthday candle. That's a parent lapse. And the idea that I ruined my birthday party was completely upside down. It wasn't my fault. But my point is, I was sharing with my mother these stories, and she said to me, very courageously, she said, I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't even making that point. I was just sharing the stories. And she said, I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't your fault. You shouldn't have been able to wander across the street. I was sharing with my wife this last week about how many times I got my fingers slammed in the door as a kid, the car door. It happened multiple times. It wasn't my fault. I was a child. My parents were preoccupied. I was too much. So, of course it's going to happen when I feel insecure. When I don't feel like I'm seen. Of course I'm going to try to get attention. Of course. What would your inner child, what would your younger self ask from you? And how would you respond? Well, we learn to reparent ourselves. We learn to find people where we can share our fears and our feelings with a safe someone. Ideally, it's our partners. Sometimes if our parents do their work, if you do your work, it can be you. We learn to say things like, I'm afraid you're going to leave me. Or even simply, I'm just afraid. We avoid giving advice and shaming the feelings. We learn to listen, understand, and be present. In our intensive program, we do this in the field also. We do these role plays, these kind of, they're called psychodramas. Sometimes during these role plays, I will ask a participant to give an ideal response. What they think, how would you want your mother or father to respond to you? And part of what I'm trying to get a sense of is whether or not they've had an experience with a secure or healthy attachment. And I'll tell you, many people can't imagine an ideal response. They don't know what to say. I've shared the attachment responses worksheet many times with what it looks like. Phrases like, thank you for telling me, tell me more, I appreciate knowing. That sounds hard, I am sorry, I'm here, I'm listening. I've shared this graphic many times. Versus the other side, which is you're overreacting, you're being silly, you're being sensitive, you're scaring me. Do we know what it would sound like? Can we imagine it? I've been surprised in my work how afraid people are, children and parents, to let go of their shame. I had a therapist one time tell me, if I let go of my shame, it's going to be worse. And I can understand that a little bit, right? We think shame is like the guardrails. We think that we're going to become psychologically an anarchist, right? Doing anything we want, hedonistic. And it can be messy. When we reduce our shame and guilt, it can be messy in the middle. But ultimately, it's healing. Ultimately, it's the only way to achieve growth, healing, and enlightenment. But it's all we know. You know, being the tough coach. My kid just needs a kick in the pants. It's all we know. Like I said, when you think about your inner child, if you can imagine going back, a very common response, instinct, is to say things like to the child, you'll be okay. But reassuring somebody can be dismissing, actually. was sharing an experience today with somebody, with a team, where I was listening to somebody's trauma story, some of their anger about the emotional abuse they received from a step-parent. And I was asking the group members to relate to the child, but nobody could relate. They could give him advice. They were telling him how anger is toxic and anger only hurts you. And I kept asking for them to relate. And finally, I just modeled it by saying, I know what it's like to feel anger and hate for somebody who hurt me. I definitely have been there. And you could see, and you will recognize that. When I said that the young man's shoulders dropped by 2 inches, right? You could see his central nervous system regulate and relax because he felt seen and understood. He didn't have to prove himself. He didn't have to justify who he was. He didn't have to be somebody for somebody else or get it right. And in the end, over time, he healed. Not because of my lectures, not because of the tools that we gave him, but because we gave him a safe place to work it out. Saying you should, giving advice, is the opposite of listening. Learning to say, I am with you, talk to me. I can hold you, I can be with you. And the fact of the matter is, once you have been loved and accepted in this way, you'll want to share that with others. You'll heal. Beyond fear and shame, there's a place. And when you have found it, you'll want to take everybody you know there. You'll spend the rest of your life wanting to give that same kind of love to the world. So what are the take-homes? This stuff takes time, folks, and practice. That's why I'm happy to see so many repeat listeners and viewers of this, because it takes time. By watching the webinars, by listening to the podcast, you're simply immersing yourself in a sensibility, a way of being that you weren't taught, that our dominant culture doesn't teach. And by the way, I'm not taking credit for this. I didn't invent any of this. I experienced it. And when I thank Jamie Gill for giving me that experience, she says the same thing to me that I'm going to say to you. I am just doing for you what somebody did for me. It takes time and exposure and practice. Your inner voice and acting it out on your struggling child. How you respond to your inner child, it's going to parallel to some extent how you respond to your struggling child, your literal child in the world. And the relationship between healing your inner child, learning a new way to be with yourself, and learning a new way to be with a child, the parallel is phenomenal. Your ability to develop compassion with yourself will lead to more compassion with others who struggle. I've told the story, I think I wrote about it in the recent book. I've told the story that a mutual friend of mine expressed some anger at another friend colleague who had done something to try to intentionally hurt me. And my friend, I think in an act of solidarity, said, I don't forgive that person. I don't forgive her. And I said, I do. I did the moment that she did it. The moment she said it in a meeting. And they said to me, well, you're a better person than I am. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm not a better person. I've just come to realize that if I judge her, I have to judge myself. I've made the same kind of mistake dozens of times in my life. Gandhi said it in the interview made famous by the movie about him. He said, I have so much patience for other scoundrels, I believe was the word he used, because he's understood that about himself. He's understood his own darkness. Somebody asked me on social media just this week about this. The relationship we have with ourselves is the template for all of our relationships. you're really just playing it out. It's so cool when children in the wilderness go along over time. You know, when they first get there, they'll say, and they'll write letters home to their parents saying, everybody here is different than me. Everybody here is worse. Of course, they're making a case that this is not the right place. And when they grow and they open up and they learn, you know what they say? 6 weeks in, they turn to the person next to them after hearing their story. And they'll say, you know what? I never did the things that you described that you did. But let me tell you how what I did is so much like that. I never did drugs, but my drug was anger. I never stole from my grandmother. But let me tell you how I lied to people. One of the signs of mental health is seeing the similarities. That's why othering, racism, right? Creating others, that's the opposite. That's the sign of mental illness, right? Of trauma, of unhealed wounds. The relationship we have with ourselves is the template for all of our relationships. And you have to find somebody, folks, who can see you. You have to find an adequate therapist who is big enough to hold you. You have to find a therapist that can apologize when they make a mistake. You have to find a therapist that when you feel uncomfortable, they can be accountable, who is secure enough in themselves that they can generously love you, that they don't need to protect themselves, their ego, getting it right, so forth and so on. I say this to parents all the time. I'm not telling you to deny your feelings. That would be insane to suggest that. What I'm telling you is it won't hurt at some point. That when your child says that to you, or your friend or your spouse says that to you, you won't repress hurt. It just won't hurt. Because of the work that you've done, you'll know that it's not about you. And if what they say about you is accurate, you won't need to defend it because you've already made peace with the fact that you're a fallible, imperfect, bumbling human being just like everybody else. Many, many people feel such an obligation to protect their parents. They spend so much time going right to forgiveness and understanding their parents that they don't give validity to their own experience because there was an unconscious message in the family to protect the parents' fragile ego. That's the resistance to sometimes going back and doing historical work. I have no instinct for any of my children to say that I'm a great dad or was a great dad. Doesn't matter to me. It's more important to me that they're able to completely and wholly honor their experience as my child. All the good and all the bad and everything in between. Good intentions. Good intentions is a subtle way of gaslighting. It's just not true. I have clients at our intensives, I have clients in the wellness say this all the time. Well, they had good intentions. And my response is, it wasn't a good intention. It was just insecurity or anxiety or fear. It's not bad. I'm not saying it's a bad intention, but they weren't doing it from a place of love. They were doing it from a place of fear and control. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just not, you don't have to dismiss it. You don't have to relate it to good intentions. I have a line in my book that says, when clients come and tell me that they had an ideal childhood, I tell them that therapy can fix that. It's important that we destroy the idealization of childhood. It wasn't good or bad, it was everything. It was all of it. And whatever it was is okay. And that fear and blame that we have about blame and the victim stance, again, it often can be traced back to a parent creating a culture in a family that protects them as the good one. Honoring coping mechanisms, defenses, symptoms, even though they don't work anymore. I hear in some self-help literature this idea that we don't have to be afraid anymore because the threat isn't there. That's a common thing that people will say in the process. But the fact of the matter is, they were there for a good reason at one point. They were present in our lives because we were scared. And to honor that experience is to honor our inner child. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions, if there are any. Somebody says, my child told me a story like your story as a 1-year-old while he was in Evoke. He's doing relatively well now, but he doesn't want to hear me acknowledge or talk about that this acting out of his was not his fault, that I and his father were responsible. I know he is still suffering. How can I start to open this up? That's a very good question. I think it's just important that you spend time listening and taking lead from him. There's something else going on in this story. There's something else going on where he's feeling perhaps an invasion. It feels intrusive to him, perhaps. I don't know for sure the answer, but he's giving you some cue. And so if I was the therapist, I would be curious to find out what's the barrier about. And again, it could be he's protecting you, even though you're not asking for it anymore. But it could be instilled in him so internalized, so internally that he can't escape it. Someone else writes this one. It is important to find someone who can see you. But what if a person does not have that in their life? What if their friends do not do the work and don't even understand that everyone can benefit from work? I have looked for that someone and do have a therapist, but most people do not understand. And as someone alone going through life, it is sometimes, especially lately with COVID, a lonely place to be. Yep. I was just talking about that with a group of parents last night. As you grow, it's going to get lonely at times. At the top end of the normal bell curve of emotional growth, it gets really lonely. Finding your people, your tribe, people like you is a quest. So mostly I just validate your experience, and finding a good therapist is a start. I would say at least once every 2 or 3 sessions, I spend some time in therapy talking to my therapist about how lonely it is. Al-Anon, Coda can help, but you're right. And it's worth looking. Sometimes my therapist will say that's what books are for. Read some of the great literature, and you'll find your friends there. But ultimately, it is the truth of this reality. They're out there. They're not in abundance. They're in support groups like this. That's why your children, in some ways, are attracted to other children who have gone through this stuff, who are struggling, because they understand them. That's why I feel more at home with you than I do at a dinner party over at the club, because you get it. All right, upcoming events. If you want to do a deep dive into this work, and what I've talked about tonight is a core theme of the work we do at our intensives. We're doing them online and in person, and they're filling up. We have special protocols, safety protocols for COVID-19. It includes testing before you come. Even I get tested, or the facilitator gets tested before you come. So we welcome them online. If you want to do it at home, we welcome you in person in Utah. So you can do them in person or online. We have wonderful staff. And Evoke Therapy Programs Intensives is psychotherapeutically grounded in this kind of attachment work, this kind of attachment theory. So we have an in-person one in September. Well, you can just go to our website because some of these dates are old, or just email intensives@evoketherapy.com. We do have an Embracing You for women of color, run by women of color, and we have it at a special rate, and there are sponsorships available, and that's at the end of September. So that's a unique thing I'll just mention. If you want to do a Pursuits Adventure trip by yourself, with your child, with your partner, think of Therapy Light, think of Sober Fun. These can also be tacked on to the end of a program, either Evoke or another program, to help you get kind of that middle time, but you still have some time together doing something fun with the therapeutic support, anywhere from 3 to 30 days. Upcoming parent support groups, check those out online. Email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. We have support groups for both our alumni and current parents, and also for our alumni intensive participants. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, adult children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org for reference for resources that are affordable or free in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on any podcast app. Just search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there by searching Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram @Evoke Therapy and @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can also find Evoke Therapy programs and Evoke Therapy Intensives. Excuse me. You can also go to evokefamilyfoundation.org to find out about more opportunities to give support to people who can't afford therapy. And of course, our blog has new content each week. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. The audiobook is available. Also, the audiobook for the new book will be out any day now. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. Any other questions, Malia? Looks like there are no questions. We're going to be shifting our format to the way that we used to do it. So every other broadcast will be a Q&A. Please feel free to invite the siblings of Evoke family, Evoke participants. Please feel free to invite them if you think it's appropriate, or your extended family members and friends if they want to learn about it. This is for them and for you. So the next one will be a question and answer for siblings, family, and friends. It'll be Monday, September 14th. It's a different time. It'll be 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So hope you join us and share that with those that in your support system to help them understand what your family is going through. They can ask any questions there. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Like I always say, thank you for and on behalf of your family and your loved ones for the work that you're willing to do by tuning in and listening and watching. Take care, folks. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.